attempt made to identify, establish, and document that this was a standard available and adopted in Texas. It is quite common for different regions or different states to have different standards of practice. I doubt, except for perhaps the field of DNA, there is such regularity that there is some sort of a national standard. In fact, the whole point of the National Science Academy's report was there is not this national standard. There are a lot of regional standards. So to go back in time and come up with an academic, theoretical arson investigation standard based upon academic documents, and then to suggest that an individual in Corsicana, Texas, had to theoretically follow that model to be within the standard of practice for that field at that time is, as Sarah has suggested, an unfair standard to apply. In fact, he was doing what he was taught for the period of time. He wasn't, making stuff up on his own or identifying his own separate standards. We can certainly criticize in hindsight the results of that, and that's why things evolve and get better. But to put a label, particularly on a man who's not even alive, to come in here and explain that standard of negligence or misconduct, I think is a stretch, and that's why I was comfortable with the recommendation.
I think Byler goes on to say, when he says there's a natural period of time before it achieves the status of the standard of care, he goes on to say that, and that was based on the publication of the first edition of NFPA 921. When he talks about the publication of the second edition of NFPA 921 in 1995, he says, and this is again on page 1 of the report, says by 1995, the standard of practice as well as was well established but not yet universally accepted. So even it takes a while for any of these new standards to be accepted by the scientific community. And given the non-scientific nature of some of the fire investigators, I think you have to accept that there is going to be a lag period. He goes on to say on page 2 that fire investigation as actually practiced fell well short of the teachings of texts, courses, and articles. And he's talking about those authoritative texts like Dehaan and Lentini that reiterate the standards of NFPA 921 and exemplify them. So I think he's quite clearly telling us that the standards that were practiced by fire investigators fell well short of the science. And one of the things I want to clarify amongst for the commission members is that the panel, I think, unanimously felt that there was no question that the science was flawed. By today's standards, the science was flawed. But the question for us was there professional negligence or misconduct? And in order for us to reach that determination that it was, we would have to believe that it was completely reasonable for those fire investigators to have absorbed that scientific material and the standard of NFPA 921. And that was, and that's a leap. That's a much more difficult question. We were really asking ourselves, we said the critical question was, were the published standards of NFPA 921 and the associated scientific literature, the science that existed, generally accepted by fire investigators at the time that document was offered in 1992, which was the very year that NFPA 921 was published. So that's the critical question. Were those scientific standards accepted by fire investigators at the time? And if our conclusion is no, they weren't generally accepted in 1992 by fire investigators, there's no question the science was flawed, the scientific data existed, it disproved some of the theories. But had it yet permeated through to fire investigators that were testifying at the time, the answer is probably no. So for our purposes of professional negligence, I think our answer from the panel is that it doesn't constitute professional negligence or misconduct. But we agreed that the science was flawed. Now that has implications in terms of the case as a whole, but that doesn't concern the commission because we're very limited in our scope. We can only look at the science.
And I assume from our use of the phrase that the science was flawed, we're not drawing any conclusions about how that might have impacted upon the case, the guilt, the innocence, but that other people and other entities, they're free to do with that what they want.
I also want to mention that despite the fact that the 921 came out in 1992, there was still some concern raised about some of the signs and indicators at the scene. And in fact, these were the concerns that were addressed by the National Institute of Justice, and they published a very detailed report after doing a lot of studies and conducting studies in various locations and measuring room temperatures and oxygen and carbon monoxide and dioxide levels, etc. This was published in 1997, as a matter of fact, and the NIJ report. And I think it was conducted by the Fire Safety Engineering Division of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So this was in 1997. So although 921 came out in 1992, there were still some questions being raised, and this is why the study was commissioned. And the study, in fact, is addressing all those what they call traditional indicators, and of course comes back and say that these are technically not defensible anymore. So it reinforces what 921 is saying. And the only reason I'm mentioning that is that you can see that even at the national level there was some concern, not just the state of Texas, national level. And this is why these studies were commissioned.
I would point out, if we come back in another 20 years, somebody will be sitting here criticizing 921 or whatever version exists. Scientists have to, and experts such as those that worked in arson, have to work with the conditions and the knowledge that they have available at the time. Years later, and in hindsight, those conditions may change. But before we put the label of negligence or misconduct on an individual, I think when we discussed the policies and procedures, we all agreed that we would hold people accountable based upon the standard as it existed when they were working on these things. And I think that's the one consistent thing that Sarah and I have found joint agreed ground on. And I feel very comfortable with that.
But not to suggest that the scientific data wasn't there to support it. It was there, but it had not yet been absorbed or universally accepted.
Right,
It had
and
not
that's
permeated fire investigators in particular.
And that's a very fluid thing to do. The area that I would compare this to, and we don't have any psychiatrists here, so I'll feel a little more freer talking about it. As prosecutors, when I came in, there was this DSM-3, the diagnostic manual for figuring out whether somebody had a mental disease or defect. What are we on now? DSM, I think 4 or maybe 4. Okay, well, when I started out as a prosecutor, I think we were on 2. So, were those psychiatrists who were using that negligent or engaged in misconduct? If we looked at DSM-4 and compared to what they did, that would be completely unfair to do that. The other thing would be, at what point do we shift from 2 to 3? Well, that's a very fluid situation as well. It can be regional, it can be national, it can be local, and in the scientific world, Sarah, I assume you don't get a letter in the mail one day saying we are officially now proceeding with the following protocols. You shall never use the preceding ones again. Does it happen that cleanly?
Not usually.
Look how many standards of DNA analysis we've been through. People that used RFLT or go to PTRs, or were they idiots with the old ones? No, they were using what they had at the time. Those things shifted in a fluid way.
One of the standards that we used was the concept of multiple points of origin. You have multiple points of origin. I guess people would reasonably think that somebody had started a fire because starting a fire started in multiple areas. And research and investigation has now clearly said that that's a flawed conclusion, simply because you could have drop-down burning point. Radiation, you can have embers, flying around. And only after doing research and